Shana Tavad, everyone. One of my favorite teachings in the Talmud comes from Tractate Sanhedrin. While admonishing witnesses in capital cases to be careful with their testimony, the rabbis say, "Whoever destroys a single life, it is as if he has destroyed the entire world. And whoever saves a single life, it is as if he has saved the entire world. For every life is B'Tselem Elohim, created in the image of God, and has intrinsic value and dignity." Each of our Torah readings for the 2 days of Rosh Hashanah contains a story of the near sacrifice of a child. I struggle, as I imagine many of you do, to find a satisfactory reason for the selection of these readings. Tomorrow morning, we will read the story of the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, in which God asks Abraham to take Isaac up to Mount Moriah and sacrifice him as a burnt offering. Why this disturbing and harrowing story? With God's horrific request, Abraham's silence, and apparent willingness to sacrifice his beloved son, Isaac's silence and willingness to be the victim, and Sarah's total absence from the story. Our Torah reading this morning begins with joy, as God has promised Sarah conceives and bears a long-awaited child. Abraham and Sarah celebrate the arrival of their newborn son. After Isaac has been weaned, however, our story takes an ominous turn. Sarah sees Ishmael, Abraham's firstborn son, by his servant Hagar, playing with or perhaps mocking Isaac, and she demands that Abraham cast out that slave woman and her son, for the son of that slave shall not share in the inheritance of my son Isaac. Although Abraham is greatly distressed, he does not respond to Sarah and only listens in silence. God tells Abraham not to be distressed and to do whatever God says, whatever Sarah says. God assures Abraham that God will make a nation from Ishmael too. The next morning, we hear that Abraham rises early and gives Hagar and Ishmael some bread and some water before he casts them out into the harsh wilderness and almost certain death. When their water runs out, Hagar leaves Ishmael under a bush and walks away so she won't have to witness her child's death. Then she sits and weeps loudly. In a critical turn in the story, we're told that God hears the boy's cry, even though Ishmael is silent. An angel calls to Hagar and says, "What troubles you? Fear not, for God has heard the cry of the boy where he is. Come, lift up the boy and hold him by the hand, for I will make a great nation of him." We next hear that God has opened Hagar's eyes. She now sees a well of water and lets Ishmael drink. Why these Torah stories when there are so many other uplifting and inspirational stories about the magnificence of creation, heartwarming stories of reconciliation between family members, hopeful stories of redemption despite human imperfections and mistakes, and a myriad of beautiful ethical teachings? Why these stories? I think we're meant to be disturbed by them, that we're supposed to struggle hard to find their meaning and relevance in our lives. And how might we find that meaning? Perhaps by looking at the juxtaposition of these Torah readings with what follows them. the blowing of the shofar. We hear the haunting sound of the shofar 100 times. What is the shofar saying to us? I think it is telling us, remember the ram caught by its horns in the thorn bush and sacrificed later instead of Isaac. Remember the angel that interrupts Abraham as he lifts the knife above Isaac's head, so that Abraham raises his eyes and sees the ram. Remember the angel's instructions to Abraham. Do not harm the boy. Remember that God hears Ishmael's silent cries and responds to them. Remember the angel that speaks to Hagar and comforts her. Remember that God opens Hagar's eyes so that she sees the well of water that has always been there, and so saves Ishmael's life. The sound of the shofar is intended to shake us up out of our complacency, to stir our souls, to energize us to examine our lives and our deeds, and to improve our ways. It is also our wake-up call to pay attention to the world around us, to notice and to be disturbed by the suffering and injustices we see. It says to us, open your eyes, open your hearts. Hear the silent, see the invisible. Be the angel that makes a difference in someone's life. Be upset by what you see and repair the brokenness. Let's look around the world together for a moment. We see that over 1 billion people go hungry every day. That 25,000 people die each day due to malnutrition. That every 6 seconds a child dies from starvation. We see that there are at least 27 million men, women, and children living in conditions of slavery. We see that there are over 15 million refugees, and that countless others live under totalitarian regimes or are members of groups targeted for discrimination, violence, and sometimes death. And now let's look at our city together. You see that 25% of our children go hungry at least once a week, and that the more than 1 million visits to food banks in the GTA every year represent only half of the actual need. We see that almost 1/4 of our 2.6 million fellow Torontonians live in poverty, and that almost 1/3 of our children live in poverty. We see that our homeless shelters average a 96% occupancy rate every night. We see that there are at least 10,000 homeless youth in our city during any given year, and as many as 2,000 on any given night. Most of them have left home at age 15, and 50% of them come from middle and upper income families. On the streets, the threats of violence, exploitation, drugs, and illness is constant. How can we not be disturbed by these facts? Judaism values every human life and calls upon us to respond with compassion and action. The obligation to pursue justice is at the heart of Jewish tradition. It is at the heart of the High Holy Days. During the Unatana Tokef prayer, we are told that God's decree or judgment of us can be tempered by three things: by tefillah, prayer, by tshuva, repentance, and by tzedakah, charity, or as more accurately translated, justice and righteousness. I ask you to listen for a moment to the stirring words of the prophet Isaiah, words that we will hear during the climax of our worship on Yom Kippur morning. The people ask God, "When we fast, why do you pay no heed?" And God answers, "Because on your fast day you think only of your business and oppress all your workers. Because your fasting leads only to strife and discord. Is this the fast I look for? A day of affliction? Bowing your head like a reed and covering yourself with sackcloth and ashes? Is this what you call a fast, a day acceptable to the eternal? Is not this the fast that I look for? To unlock the shackles of injustice, to undo the fetters of bondage, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every cruel chain? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry and to bring the homeless poor into your home? When you see the naked, to clothe them, and never to hide yourself from your neighbor? Then shall your light break forth like the dawn, and your healing shall quickly blossom. Your righteous one will walk before you. The glory of the Eternal One will be your rear guard. Then, when you call, the Eternal will answer. When you cry, God will say, 'Here I am.'" The Talmud teaches that the merit in the fast day lies in the tzedakah dispensed. Our fasting, our self-reflection, and our atonement alone are not complete without acts of justice, without acts of loving kindness, and without acts that demonstrate compassion toward our fellow human beings. This is our charge during the Yamim Noraim, to remember that we have a partnership and a covenant with God, to perform acts of righteousness and to work together to fulfill the words of the prophet Isaiah. Our world is broken, and it needs our care and attention. Our city is broken in many places, and it too needs our care and our attention. As Jews, we are obligated to be engaged in Gimilut Chasadim, acts of kindness, by caring for the immediate needs of the widow, the orphan, and the stranger, by feeding the hungry and clothing the naked. As Jews, we are also obligated to go beyond Gimilut Chasadim and to pursue justice, to find sustainable solutions that break the cycle of poverty and injustice. Maimonides regards enabling a person to become self-sufficient as the highest level of tzedakah. At Holy Blossom Temple, we have a long history of serious commitment to social justice and social action. From our earliest days, we have raised our voices to fight for civil rights in Canada and the United States, for women's rights, and for the end of apartheid. We have raised our voices to support migrant farm workers, Vietnamese boat people, the poor and homeless in our city, and people afflicted with HIV/AIDS. Throughout all these years, championing the rights and dignity of new immigrants and reforming Canada's immigration laws has been a constant feature of our social justice and social action efforts. We should be proud of our legacy, and we should be proud of the compassion demonstrated by our current work with the Out of the Cold program, or Bikur Cholim Committee, the Roma Initiative, and this year's new High Holy Day food drive. But can't we do more as individuals and as a congregation? Shouldn't we support the efforts of organizations such as American Jewish World Service, Oxfam Canada, and the Toronto-based Free the Children? Organizations that devote their energies to developing sustainable solutions that lead to self-sufficiency in communities throughout the global South. How about making service trips to the developing world? What about partnering with local Jewish and multi-faith organizations that are fighting against poverty, hunger, homelessness, insufficient mental health and drug programs for our youth, unfair immigration policies, and are also advocating for a fairer and more humane Toronto? Whatever we do, we need your help to define our priorities and to make choices. If Holy Blossom Temple is to continue to be the standard bearer for social justice, the clear and strong voice against social injustice, we need you to share your knowledge, your talents, your ideas, your passions, and your energies with us. I invite you to join me in deep and serious conversations about the kind of world we as a congregation want to help build, the kind of city we want to help create, and the kind of congregation we want to be. A last comment about the shofar. The sound of the shofar is not only a call to action, it is also a message of hope. If we look at the order of the sounds that we just heard, we see that each group begins with a tekiah, a whole note, followed by shvarim, a broken note divided into 3 parts, or by truah, an entirely fragmented sound, 9 very brief sounds. But each broken note is followed by a whole note, another tekiah. One mystical understanding of the order of these notes is as follows. I started off whole. I became broken, even splintered into fragments. But I shall become whole again. I shall become whole again. Our communities can become whole again. The problems facing the world and our city will seem overwhelming at times. We may experience compassion fatigue and burnout. But when we do, we should remember the words of the 19th century clergyman Edward Everett Hale, who said, I am only one, but I am one. I cannot do everything, but I can do something. And I will not let what I cannot do interfere with what I can do. This is my prayer for each of us on Rosh Hashanah. May we open our hearts to the suffering we see around the world and in our own community. May we open our minds to learn about the causes of injustice and seek solutions. May we open our mouths to speak out against inequality and to educate others. May we hear the silent. May we see the invisible. Amen.